Alright, hello again to anyone watching. Today I'm going to go over, as requested, a Firelight Rush build that I've been working on the last, I guess over the course of this last week, I suppose. Um, for this video, I kind of want to talk a little bit more about how I approach building Firelight Rush. A lot of the cards I've kind of covered a bit on my Mono Fire Rush video, and there's not too much to say on the actual cards I've chosen, but um, yeah, when it comes to like approaching how you want to build Firelight Rush, it's kind of a tricky deck because you can approach it maybe from the direction of being like a mono fire deck that plays some of the good light cards, or maybe a mono light deck with a bunch of the mono light evolutions, but that's splashing some of the powerful fire cards. Maybe you choose to build it around Draco Mech Commander, um, or you just play a build that kind of just is super low to the ground. And there's a lot of ways to approach the deck, and so I guess when I was trying to figure out, of course I've had a lot of experience playing a variety of different builds of Firelight Rush over my time playing Kaijudo as well. So there's been a bit of experience, and um, when I was kind of requested to make a Firelight deck, I kind of asked myself what is the big reason to be playing Firelight Rush and sort of build from that principle. And I think there's like a couple answers, but the answer I really identified is just that you get to play 6 attacking 1-drops, that you get to play both Blaze Belcher and Magris. I think that's the biggest draw to playing the deck. I think I asked my brother the question and he said like the multi-civs, but I don't really think that's the case. Like the powerful multi-civs, I just don't think that's actually the incentive to play Firelight Rush. The incentive all comes from getting to play 6 attacking 1-drops. And I'll kind of cover a little bit more on the multi-civs in I guess a few minutes, but the reason it's so important to have those 6 attacking 1-drops is it's all about the goal of the deck that I was speaking to in the Mono Fire Rush profile, where you're really just trying to get ahead on mana spent on things, right? Like just playing more to the board and keeping ahead in terms of plays and cards played than over your opponent. And when you have 6 attacking 1-drops that are serving the purpose of killing your opponent, it just makes the deck so much more powerful. It allows you to curve out so much more effectively, making like basically doubling your chances of having a 1-drop on turn 1, and then even being able to go 1-drop, 2-drop, and then play another 1-drop and a 2-drop on turn 3. Like that, those kinds of plays are what really lets this deck get ahead, and that's what you want to play for. And that's what playing the 1-drops really lets you do. So that's the big incentive to playing Firelight. And one of the reasons I really don't think it's the multi-civs is the multi-civs sort of run, they just directly oppose that entire goal. Because when you're playing these multi-civ cards, they don't let you do what you want to do. When you have to put a multi-civ card in mana, you're going down in mana for the turn, right? You're removing yourself access from a resource. You're compromising your progressions. Now you can't go 1 2 2 1. So instead of you just have to compromise those progressions to play these multi-civ cards. So when you're considering a lot of these multi-civ cards that are played in the Firelight Rush deck, you really want to evaluate like how much better are they really than the alternatives you could be playing, and you really have to factor in how big of a downside that multi-civ ability really is, because again, it's antithetical to what Rush is trying to accomplish when you're just refusing yourself the ability to actually properly curve out, restricting yourself on mana when that's the whole purpose of the deck. So kind of going through them, there's like the commonly played ones. I guess you could start with Metal Max. Like Metal Max is kind of defaulted to being played because it's just the biggest 2-drop, but you really want to look at like how much better is, like how good of an ability is 1500 power more than just a vanilla 2-drop? Like how good is that? And compare that to, like, is it that much better than just playing like a Bronca, like a 2-drop for 2000 power? Is it that much better? And how big is the downside to being a multi-civ? And I would argue it's like generally going to be a bigger downside to be a multi-civ. Now, when it is a 2-drop card, the multi-civ tag is a little less effective, or a little less impactful, because you can just curve out into the 2-drop. Like the 2-drop's going to be your play the majority of the time, so you're not super worried about putting it in mana. But That said, again, like the 1500 power is not really. It's a really hard to evaluate how effective that ability really is, but it's very easy to evaluate that multi-civ is detrimental. So carrying on, there's like I think Dawnblaze Patrol like that is like a powerful 3-drop multi-civ that's played again because it's kind of the biggest thing. But I mean with Dawnblaze Patrol specifically, it doesn't even really crack like the even on ignoring the multi-civ tag entirely. I don't think it even cracks like the top three drops that I would even consider playing anyway. So it's not really there on power level. Like it's just worse than Valkyrie and Jethro Starter and even like I think Blinder Beetle or Blinder Beetle, sorry. And I don't even want to be playing much more than 7 or 8 3-drops anyway, so that card just doesn't even crack the the quality of 3-drops regardless of the multi-civ tag. So the other ones that are commonly played would be things like Blitzer Mech and Major Owl, I guess, as like the top end cards. And those cards are both very powerful for what they do, but let's take like Blitzer Mech for example. That like I mean, this is kind of a weird comparison, or not, maybe not super weird, but compare it to Draglide. Obviously, Blitzer Mech is a much more powerful card than Draglide, right? The tap ability is super relevant in a lot of matchups, and in the matchups it's not. It's still just got 500 more power. Like, it's basically the same card as Draglide, and then in other matchups it's going to be quite a bit better. But when you consider the card, it's basically just, like, it's a better top deck than Draglide, but it's much worse in your opening hand than Draglide because it's a multi-civ. So we don't really think of cards necessarily being dead in Kaijudo because they can always be put in mana, right? So your card is never really a brick, and no card is ever really an absolute brick because again, you can, especially in your opening hand, because you can just put it in your mana zone and then continue on curving out, right? So that's kind of the strength of a card like Draglide, is you're just basically playing a card that in the early game, it'll always be just a mountain. It'll be a card that goes in mana, and then the reason you play it though is so that you can have a powerful top deck in the later game. So you have more powerful cards to draw into. Now Draglide's not like the most powerful card, but regardless, like just having those fast attacks to draw into is powerful for the late game, but it's never dead, right? If you can't cast it because it's the early game, it just functions as a mountain. And in the late game, it's just a card you want to draw. You actively want to draw it. So you need to play some number of powerful top decks, and you can do so at little downside because you get to play them all as lands. Now when it comes to Blitzer Mech, yes, it's a more powerful top deck than Draglide, but it runs the risk of actually being a brick, because when you consider, like, Draglide's never dead, right? Again, it's either a mana or a powerful card you can actually cast. Whereas Blitzer Mech, because it's a multi-civ, sometimes you can't put it in mana. It's not a card you can put in mana, right? Because you need to cast your 1-drop on 1. You want to cast your 2-drop on 2. When are you putting this Blitzer Mech in mana? So you open it in your opening hand, and it's literally you're playing with a 4-card, 5-card hand because you're down that whole resource, because it's not a card you can put in mana, and it's not a card you can cast. So you're just lowering the amount of cards in your hand. You really want your powerful top decks to be cards that you can also just throw in mana, right? Because that mitigates the entire downside of playing them, or playing cards you can't cast. So the same kind of thing goes for Major Owl. And I would argue Blitzer Mech's just a better card, because if you're going to play one of those cards, Blitzer Mech being 4 mana is such a big difference, especially for a deck that plays so low to the ground. It's a little bit harder to get to Major Owl, and obviously Major Owl, of course, is a more powerful card than even Blitzer Mech, but Blitzer Mech is much more castable. It's going to be relevant more often than the time. So if I were to play one of the two, I would play Blitzer Mech, but again, it runs the risk of being dead in your opening hand. So it's a much, like, I think it may just be like a worse card than Draglide because of that. All that said though, even though you might want to make your deck as consistent as possible, you do need to make some concessions for power. So even if that is the case, right, it runs the risk of being dead, you do need access to some powerful cards. You have to make some concessions to just the pure power level of cards. So that's why you could still play Blitzer Mech, because you really need it. And it is strong in certain matchups, especially strong in matchups like where darkness blockers are relevant, like a Gloom Hollow. Like, Blitzer Mech just completely embarrasses that. So it has applications, but again, you really need to consider. And that's why in this deck, like, I've really moved away from multi-civs because of all those issues. They just compromise your ability to spend mana and curve out effectively, and that's what this deck is entirely about. So they're just, even again, like, Blitzer Mech is a better card than Draglide, but is it really that much better? And it has this huge downside. So that's sort of one of the fundamental parts of my approach to building this deck now, is to keeping that heavily in consideration. Like, I know people kind of, they didn't play a ton of multi-civs traditionally in the Firelight Rush deck. Like, people would tend to hover around like in the 5-7 range. Like, they knew not to be jamming like 10 multi-civs like you would in maybe like a Bant tempo deck. So they were, but I think even like 5 to 7 is still way too many. Like, I'm thinking like you should be playing like 0 to 2, maybe 3, right? Like, I'm thinking like just very, very, very few multi-civs. Um, and yeah, this isn't something that I kind of just came up with just right now on the spot. Like, this is kind of a principle that I developed over time, like especially when I was developing and working on some Draco Mech Commander variants of Firelight Rush. What I found over time was like the most effective builds of that kind of deck that I made were ones where the only multi-civ in my deck was Draco Mech Commander, and I was just building my deck to consistently curve out into it. So I was, by having Draco Mech as my only multi-civ, I would be able to hold on to that as the card in my hand that I'm playing towards, and then everything else will be dedicated to just making consistent mana drops and curving out effectively. So I was just cutting all the Metal Maxes, all the Dawn Blaze Patrol, all that stuff. I would just not play any of those. Draco Mech would be my only multi-civ, and then it was the most effective variant of Draco Mech Commander that I could build, was by following that kind of principle. And that's something I've carried over to my approach now. And um, this build, spoiler, is not a Draco Mech variant. I think Draco Mech is a powerful card, but it has a lot of issues. It like it's a strong card, but it's just you have to play towards it, and it's not necessarily the most effective, especially in a format with like Gloom Hollow and things that like Slayers especially. There's a lot of problems with the card, but it is powerful and you can win with it. I suppose you could pretty easily just put Draco Mech Commander into this deck I've built, but yeah, this is not a variant. I think the card is just not really needed. So with all that said, I suppose I can just show off the list that I have. Yeah, like what stands out, a lot of these cards carry over from the Mono Fire deck. Just to run through quickly, obviously you have like the 6 1-drops, which is like the core of the deck. The Flame Spinner is just the most powerful red 2-drop, I think, just to couple with the fast attacks to give you very big push plays. Luminous Shield Wing, I just think, is one of the better light 2-drops. Like, the ability comes out pretty relevantly, actually. Like, it's a pretty relevant ability and gives you maybe an extra turn to survive sometimes, and that can be really powerful. Metal Max is a card I have. This is my most. I've gone through like maybe 3 to 4 iterations of this deck as I've been working on it recently, and Metal Max is the most recent addition. Just because like I found like I really wanted some 2-drop to have like a counterplay to what's it called? Sumo Artichoke. Like, that card I felt like this deck was, as it was built, was pretty weak to Artichoke. Maybe not super weak, but this is kind of a concession. And again, as I was saying, like, even though it is a multi-civ, when you draw, or when you do open this card, like, you can just pretty easily play it as your 2-drop. It's not like Blitzer Mech where it's a dead card that you can't cast or put in mana. This one you can generally cast, so it's not, doesn't run as big of a risk of actually being a dead card. So that's why I've chosen to play it, and I think I've evaluated kind of that I do want that 1500 power for a purpose. So that's why I'm playing this card. But that said, I mean, I think the most recent change I did make was just cutting the 3rd tribute and like a 3rd one of these, because I both wanted something that could kind of withstand Sumo Artichoke and even like an Arbiter coming out of shields, while also I did want a 10th 2-drop I found as well. So it served the purpose of adding an extra 2-drop, but I also, yeah. And the reason for 2 is just so it reduces, it's like a minor consideration, but it does reduce the risk of drawing two of them in your opening hand, which can be pretty bad. Um, Cloudwalker Drone is just like another 2-drop. Not much to say. Like this, again, could be whatever 2-drop. I wanted to make sure I had enough light cards to very often cast like the Magris on turn 1. So that's why I kind of conceded to having more light 2-drops than fire, because I felt like all the rest of the fire cards up the curve were very, very important. Continuing with the fast attacks, obviously these cards are just, I think, some of the most important, powerful cards for the rush deck. Lava Racer is a card that wasn't in some of my initial builds. I think my initial variant did have, it did have as I had 2 multi-civs, and they were blitzer mechs instead of the metal maxes, and I had them as an additional top end card. And I mean, they were okay. Like, they were just another top deck. I wanted to try it out. They were fine, but they would be kind of bad in my opening hands, and they were a fine top deck, but I felt like I wasn't really needing them, so I moved away from that. And then the other card was another top end card. I was playing Blinder Beetle Prime as well. Like, I had the full Enforcer 2-drop lineup, and I had Blinder Beetle Prime at the top end. And I just found like Blinder Beetle Prime, even in the matchups where I thought it was good. Like the theory that I approached was, in some of the games against more of the controlling decks, when you stick Keeper of Laws, and then the game kind of slows down on both sides. Both people sort of build up a bit more of a board position. And then in those games, even especially when they might give you an extra card or two, or probably just an extra card when they maybe have to cast a spell, you get a draw off Laws. And then again, as you're building up a board position, you can kind of draw into Blinder Beetle Prime and then blow out their side of the board and push through for game. So that was like the real theory behind Blinder Beetle Prime. But I just found like I wasn't really needing it. Like, this deck curves out to 3 a lot more often, and you're not as much playing towards like the 5 mana that you would need for Blinder Beetle Prime. And I just wasn't finding that those games, even in those matchups where I thought like the Keeper of Laws slow down the pace, it just wasn't really necessary in those games, and those games didn't happen as often as I really thought they would, just because like the deck just curved out so quickly and so effectively. And yeah, the Keeper of Laws was just fine enough as like a hexproof card. So when I moved away from like those top end Blitzer mech and Blind Beetle Prime, I moved more towards the cheap fast attack of Lava Racer, which, and it's actually been performing really well. Like, I didn't have this in my initial builds, but it kind of stuck with me through some of my later iterations, just because I found it was just doing its job really well. Like, again, you curve out pretty low in this deck, so having this, it's not necessarily a 2-drop in the same sense as the other ones, but it's another draw that you can draw to later. And again, it's just, when you're curving out at 3, a lot of the time you would be top decking, and if it was a Draglide or a Blitzer mech as a fast attack, you wouldn't even be able to cast it and would slow you down. But having Lava Racer as a 2-drop just meant you could cast it more effectively. And again, it pairs very well with like the Comet Missile, Ashen Tributes, Flame Spinners, because when you do curve out to 4 with this deck, a fair amount of the time too, you're just dropping double 2-drop. So being 2 mana is really important. The 5 missile effects, I think my initial build did have 4, and then I went up to 6, and then, like I said, I ended up cutting one for another the 10th 2-drop, because I found like in some matchups I wasn't, like, I think 5 is enough of this effect, and it's really important, especially when this deck doesn't have as many larger creatures. It's not as much Evo based, so you have a harder time getting through blockers. So I really wanted, the 6 was good, but I was finding I wasn't having enough 2-drops that I was consistently casting. Like, I would just not have like the 2-drop on turn 2 or the 2-drop on turn 3 to pair with a 1-drop. And so I ended up moving towards one more 2-drop, but I could very easily see going back to 6, just because it is so important to have to get blockers out of the way. That said, I do have one Blinder Beetle, which can kind of serve as one of these effects while also being a creature. This card is particularly good against like the darkness blockers, when you're like things that aren't skirmisher, basically. Like when It allows you to push through Gloom Hollow really well, so you can curve out into it, and you can, rather than having to take a turn off to Comet Missile the Gloom Hollow and push in, you can develop your board while doing that, and then that way you can save your Comet Missile. Like, it's just such a strong curve against like those darkness-based decks when you can go 1-drop, 2-drop, Blinder Beetle, tap their Gloom Hollow, and then you can follow that up with Comet Missile their Gloom Hollow plus play like another 2-drop or a 1-drop. Like, those kinds of curves really just annihilate those decks. The 4-drops that I have played are Heliflame. I mean, this card just attacks over a lot of the blockers, so it lets you chip shot them out. 5,000 power being really relevant. Yeah, just I think like probably just the most consistent best. It's like Never Dead again. It's going to be one of your better top decks, and also at the same time, you can just put it in mana early with no real worry about it being like a multi-civ there. Keeper of Laws. This card just obviously I think this is probably my favorite creature in the game. Keeper of Laws is awesome. The hexproof is just so relevant. Even though it is kind of like a slow card, like it's a 4-mana creature, it's not super huge, but it just performs so well. Like, it lets you slow down the pace a bit, build up some more resources. It's just a perfect complement that you can drop to like an already established board, which this deck does really well. It builds up a very powerful board, and then Keeper of Laws just shuts the door when you land it. It makes it so difficult for them to play through, and when you do get additional cards, you're able to very, very effectively spend your mana. So when they do give you more cards, you just go 2-drop, 2-drop. You just replenish your board state very fast. And then Storm Spark Blast. This card does a great job. It was kind of hard for me to find like really good light cards because I felt like the fire cards were super important. The fast attacks, the 1-drops, the missile effects were super important. So, and it was harder to find like good light cards, which is why I sort of just filled out my 2-drop slot with light cards. But Storm Spark Blast is a card that's a light mana, so it can easily be just thrown down to cast Magris. And I mean, the card is just amazing as a tool your opponent has to respect it. I mean, there's so many games that come down to your opponent at 0 shields, and I mean, so many games just come down to, do they have the Storm Spark Blast or not? So it's just so powerful, and again, it is just a mana, and you need some light mana to be casting your 2-drops or Magris, so it's a perfectly fine card to open. So yeah, just making this deck super redundant. Tons of 1-drops, tons of 2-drops, and then hopefully you don't have too many problems like where you're opening up too many big things, too many of these kind of cards here. Like I said, I think the main kind of considerations, I'm not super confident in this list. I think there are some changes to be made. I think like the 3rd tribute is certainly on the table. Moving away from Metal Axe, I'm not confident about this. I haven't really place tested with Metal Axe too much. I don't see it being like a huge deal one way or another, whether it's in or out of the deck. But for the most part, like the kind of curve that I have, like the 10 2-drops, I think I'm pretty confident in how I've approached the deck, and it's performed pretty well actually. Like I've been confidently beating like the pile decks with it. It's been getting under even Lightwater Dark Tempo is a deck that was historically good against like the mono Fire Rush deck in my experience, and this deck has been pretty strong against that variant just because it goes so wide. I'm not yeah, I've just found this deck to be performing pretty well, and I think the approach is really solid, and just moving away from the multi-civs is the most important part of what I've done. And that said, like, Metal Max could come or go. Like, this could just straight up not be in the deck at all. But again, I wanted some kind of hedge towards positioning a little bit better against some of the Shield Blast creatures, because when you're playing such a low curve deck like this, the Shield Blast can be, especially Shield Blast creatures, can be a bit more detrimental. So I guess that is the list that I've been working on. Again, I think it's like 95% nailed down. Let me know your thoughts. I think the biggest thing is it's important to like identify the approach you want to take. If you do play like more of the multi-civ heavy versions, I think you're just playing a lot more of like an ineffective rush deck. You're playing a bit more of like a mid-rangey deck you're just playing more to the power of the cards, but you're just gonna kind of, I feel like that deck it's a little too slow, a little too clunky in my experience, and you just don't do an effective job of getting under people as much, and I think that's what this deck does a lot better. So again, let me know what your thoughts on my thoughts are, I guess. What if you have any counterpoints to what I've laid out? If you have any of your own input on cards maybe I'm missing from this build. Yeah, just yeah, that's my take on Firelight Rush as it stands. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. Bye.